Good evening, I'm Nima, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, January 23rd. We start the newscast in Alberta with the latest on allegations of prosecutorial interference against Premier Danielle Smith's government. The Alberta government says it could not find any emails to substantiate allegations that one of Ms. Smith's staffers wrote to Crown prosecutors. Now, this was to try to influence how they handled cases tied to the blockade at the Coutts border crossing. CBC reported last week that a staffer in Ms. Smith's office sent a series of emails to prosecutors last fall. They were questioning and challenging their approach to the cases. The Justice Department says civil servants reviewed about 1 million emails covering a 4-month period, and they found no record of contact between prosecutors and the Premier's office. All right, well, meanwhile, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says provinces and territories should not be using the notwithstanding clause preemptively. He made the comments on Monday morning. They came in response to a weekend claim by Quebec Premier François Legault. He claimed that Mr. Trudeau was attacking his province's democracy and people by suggesting he would limit the use of the clause. The notwithstanding clause lets Parliament or a provincial legislature shield a law from charter challenges. For decades, house fires on First Nations have caused deaths and injuries at a much higher rate than off the reserve. This is why the federal government is trying to help legislate fire codes on First Nations. But an internal government document shows federal officials do not have a willing partner to help, not even the Assembly of First Nations. A note prepared for Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu ahead of a meeting with Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald last October details some of these issues. But the Senior Director for the Indigenous Fire Marshal Service says there are steps that Ottawa can take now to better protect communities. Now, this includes making better funding decisions when it comes to equipment. Turning to Quebec now, where a Montreal man has been found guilty of willfully promoting hatred against Jews. A Quebec court judge said Gabriel Soyer-Chaput intended to promote hate against Jewish people in a 2017 article for neo-Nazi website Daily Stormer. The article called for, quote, nonstop Nazism everywhere, which the judge said sought to initiate violence. Mr. Soyer-Chaput had argued that the article was intended to be humorous and taken ironically. Switching gears to a Bank of Canada report on consumer expectations released last week, which says more than a quarter of Canadians expect to see deflation 5 years from now. However, economics professor Stephen Gordon of Laval University said the chance of there being such a decrease in prices is extremely unlikely. Although some prices will come down, as we've already seen with gasoline prices, Professor Gordon said higher prices for goods feed into each other through the supply chain and become baked into the economy. Prices for services are also unlikely to fall, given they're driven by wages. Over to the East Coast now, as Newfoundland and Labrador is moving to end a strike by private ambulance workers by having their services declared essential. The government opened legislature today for an emergency session to table a bill that would force ambulance staff back to work. About 120 workers with 7 private ambulance services owned by a single company walked off the job on Friday at noon. They were seeking higher wages and a better pension plan. Moving to Saskatchewan, where people who have lost family and friends to drug overdoses marched in Regina on Saturday for the city's 2nd annual Smudge Walk. Last year, there was a record 421 confirmed and suspected drug overdose deaths in Saskatchewan. Chief Evan Tapetat of Kakawistaha First Nation says drugs have taken the lives of Indigenous people at an alarming rate. And it's not just a Regina problem. Over 100 people took part in the walk. Sunwing is again announcing that it's scaling back flights, this time in Atlantic Canada. The airline has reduced its flight schedules from 3 airports in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The move affects flights from some destinations in Florida and Cuba. All right, staying in Atlantic Canada, where an application to have the home of Nova Scotia's first Black doctor preserved will be debated by Regional Council tomorrow. Clement Liguire was an unsung hero of the 1917 Halifax explosion. He was also the editor of Nova Scotia's first Black newspaper, The Atlantic Advocate. He co-founded the No. 2 Construction Battalion, Canada's only all-Black unit to serve during the First World War. The director of the Friends of Halifax Common applied to have Dr. Liguire's former home granted heritage status last year. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at a study analyzing the link between virtual family doctor visits and emergency department use. So stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back shortly. A study led by researchers with the Ontario Medical Association has found no evidence that patients substituted hospital emergency rooms for virtual visits with their family doctor in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. The peer-reviewed study was published today in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Researchers say it is significant given recent calls to reduce virtual service over quality of care concerns and ER burdens. The study says there was no evidence the pivot to virtual visits by family doctors at the outset of the pandemic led patients to turn to emergency departments instead. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into this study is Dr. Rose Zacharias, the president of the Ontario Medical Association. Doctor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Zacharias, let's start with how the study was conducted, along with the particular demographics and information it was looking into.
So the OMA studies approximately 8,000 physicians and has a look at the breakdown of virtual visits. And what we know is that this study shows that the unprecedented strain on the emergency departments, which we all have been aware of, is not associated with patients accessing their family doctors virtually.
All right, ma'am. Now, OMA researchers are saying these findings in the study are quite significant. We're hearing calls to reduce virtual service over concerns of this putting a burden on ERs, as you just addressed right now, and the quality of care overall in the healthcare system. So can you tell us a little bit more about how these findings address these concerns in particular?
So we know that inside of a patient-doctor relationship, so a family doctor that you have a relationship over a long period of time, or a referral that you received from a family doctor to see a specialist, those are really the comprehensive patient-doctor relationships that we are referring to when we say that a hybrid model of care can be very beneficial to a patient. Easier access, more convenient, following up with lab results or x-ray results, or a refill of a prescription, or even a healthcare consultation can happen between a doctor and a patient virtually on a screen and really be part of that high quality care that we want to provide for our patients.
Now, all of this is coming amid staffing shortages and burnout among healthcare workers, and a lot of people are lacking a family doctor in Ontario itself. So how is virtual primary care affecting this situation in particular?
We are very concerned about many people, well over 1 million people in Ontario that don't have a family doctor. The Ontario Medical Association is committed to working with government on solutions there. We talk about licensing internationally trained physicians and have them join the physician workforce and take on the rural, remote, and northern communities. But what we know is that when the pandemic really forced us to pivot to virtual care inside of a family practice, we know that that has not added to the strain that we see in our emergency departments. That strain exists, and for many reasons, which we understand, but the virtual care that has now been adopted by family doctors across the province, the hybrid model, occasionally virtual, occasionally in person, whenever medically appropriate, is not adding to the strain of our emergency departments.
All right, doctor. Now, as you say, the study is looking at primary care physicians with an established patient-doctor relationship, not virtual walk-in appointments. But what do we know so far about the success rate of these virtual walk-in appointments in particular?
So the virtual only clinics are not really captured in the study. There has been some studies that point to a particular finding, and that's that We know that patients who see a family physician at a virtual walk-in clinic are actually twice as likely to visit an emergency department within 30 days compared to those patients seeing their own family doctor virtually. So that's an important distinguishing factor there, that relationship, established relationship between a patient and a doctor seems to be very protective and preserving the ability to provide good quality care and not strain the healthcare system at the same time.
Some distinguishing information there for sure. All right, Dr. Zacharias, it looks like we're out of time, but again, we really appreciate you joining us today and talking to us.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right, we'll be right back. And when we return from the commercial break, we'll be looking at the planned comeback for Zellers across Canada this year. 25 stores will be opening inside select Hudson's Bay department stores this spring. And we're going to be speaking to Mr. Bruce Winder, author and retail analyst, to discuss the return of this revived retail chain. After that, of course, we're going to have more news from around the world. So don't go anywhere. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. Well, after a 10-year hiatus, Zellers is making a comeback this spring with 25 locations across Canada. But one retail expert says the chain needs a lot more than nostalgia to appeal to today's consumer. The stores are set to be located inside select Hudson's Bay department stores. Hudson's Bay Company says 5 of the locations will be in Quebec, 9 sites have been allotted to Ontario, and 4 will be in BC. Another 5 locations will be in the Prairies, and 2 will be in Nova Scotia. But amid inflation, high interest rates, and the rising cost of living, Bruce Winder, author of Retail Before, During, and After COVID-19, says the revived chain needs to offer both value and price points that connect with today's consumer. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is Mr. Bruce Winder himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on the program.
So, as we mentioned, the chain seems to be focusing a lot of its marketing on nostalgia and appealing to those who remember Zellers, the restaurant, the red color theme, etc. But how much of that same Zellers store plan or setup will be seen in these new chains? What can we expect?
Well, my understanding, based on what the company announced, is that we'll see part of it, but not that much. There isn't really discussion of a restaurant, and you know what, the stores are going to be about 8 to 10,000 square feet, which is just a fraction of the original Zeller size. And we're really going to be looking at categories, just a few categories: baby, toys, pet categories, and home decor. So just a fraction of the categories that you would have seen in a Zeller store.
Definitely sounds like just a fraction. Now, are there any new elements of this revival of Zellers that may appeal to the modern consumer?
I'm not aware of any. We really have to see sort of what happens in terms of what products they're launching, what prices they're launching. I guess the one thing that would be new to consumers, Zeller's consumers, is an online presence. So, a lot's changed in 10 years, and the new Zellers under the Bay will have a website, and they have a pretty state of the art distribution center in the Toronto area that can handle a lot of products quickly using robotics. So that's going to be probably one of the big differences, is Zellers is sort of caught up as it relates to e-commerce.
All right. Well, going back to your previous comments on price points and products that match the traditional value that consumers expect, can you tell us a little bit more about this and what exactly this would look like, especially for Zellers?
Well, I think it's going to be a real tough one, because if you look at, the competitive set has changed a lot in 10 years. You've got Walmart, who just got incredibly strong. You've got Costco, you've got Dollarama, Dollar Tree, Amazon. These have all become serious retailers in the discount segment, the value segment. So Zellers, if they're going to come back in at that price point, sort of the value price point, it's going to be tough because they only have 25 stores. And the way retail works is the more quantity you buy, the lower price you get. So it'd be pretty hard to imagine them competing with those retailers I mentioned previously.
And on that point, we know Zellers was shuttered about 10 years ago and replaced with Target for a very short 2-year period. Can you tell us what led to these shutdowns previously and how this revived Zellers can avoid this?
Yeah, it's a good point, because there's a reason why Zellers closed. Now, luckily, they were sold to Target, which was a great payday for them. But Zellers was sort of on a spiral downward, anyways. I used to work at Zellers for a couple of years, and the company was magical back in the '80s. But it just, as soon as Walmart came in '94, it just kept taking market share from Zellers, just because Walmart was run better. They had better prices, better assortment, bigger scale, better everything. So Zellers was sort of on a slow trajectory downward.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question pertaining to your research in particular. How does the evolution of consumerism during and following the pandemic play into the relatively traditional space of brick and mortar and department stores and supercenters like Walmart, Zellers, and Superstore, as you mentioned?
Well, you know what? We're changed. Consumers changed a lot during the pandemic, and now the consumer is sort of being hit by a freight train, which is really, inflation, high interest rates, job loss in the tech sector, probably more job loss, stock market's down. So it's going to be a real tough time, and this means consumers are looking for more value. They've cut back spending. They're going to continue to cut back spending. They're going to buy more private label products. More of their money's being chewed up, pardon the pun, at grocery stores. So they have to find ways to cut back in other areas that affect the retailers you mentioned.
All right, just about 30 seconds left here. But what are you particularly keeping your eyes on as Zellers prepares for its relaunch?
Well, the biggest thing I'll be looking at is the assortment. I'll be looking at the price point. I'll be looking at the assortment, the quality, the specification of the items, how big it is, what kind of signage is there, what kind of advertising, and of course, how they link it all into e-commerce. So I'll be curious to see what their go-to-market strategy is.
All right, Mr. Winder, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.
Stay with us after the break. We're going to take a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world. U.S. President Joe Biden orders national flags at half-mast after a deadly mass shooting. Turkey says Sweden should not expect its support for NATO membership. And Spotify joins a growing list of tech companies announcing job cuts. So stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. Stay with us. U.S. President Joe Biden has ordered the lowering of national flags in honor of the victims of Saturday's mass shooting in Monterey Park, California. 10 people were killed and 10 others injured in the attack. It occurred when a gunman opened fire inside a Los Angeles area ballroom dance club while people were celebrating the Lunar New Year. And it's another blow to the Asian community, which has been the target of high-profile violence in recent years. The suspect, a 72-year-old man, was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound yesterday. Tensions rise between NATO member Turkey and hopeful Sweden. This comes as Turkey's president says Sweden shouldn't expect support for NATO membership. The moves come following weekend protests in Stockholm by an anti-Islam activist and pro-Kurdish groups on Monday. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan slammed Rasmus Paludan for his Quran-burning protest on Saturday. He says it was an insult to everyone, especially to Muslims. He also criticized Swedish authorities for allowing the demonstration to take place outside the Turkish embassy in Stockholm. Mr. Erdogan also criticized Sweden for pro-Kurdish protests where demonstrators waved flags of various Kurdish groups. These included the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. The PKK is considered a terrorist group in Turkey, the European Union, and the United States. Well, amid the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Moscow was willing to negotiate with Ukraine in the early months of the war. But he says the United States and other Western nations advised Kyiv against it. Mr. Lavrov's remarks on a visit to South Africa on Monday were similar to claims made last year by Russia's President Vladimir Putin. The U.S. and other Western nations have said that Russia is not serious about negotiations to end the war. Russia has repeatedly rejected Western demands that it withdraw completely from Ukraine as a condition for any negotiations. In the latest in the developments on military aid to Ukraine, Poland's prime minister says his country will seek Germany's approval to send more Leopard tanks to the country. Poland needs the consent of Germany, which builds the tanks, in order to send them to a non-NATO country. Poland's prime minister has been pushing Europe to send more military hardware to Kyiv. All right, well, meanwhile, the European Union has slapped sanctions on dozens of Iranian officials over a crackdown on protesters. EU foreign ministers agreed to impose a travel ban and asset freeze on a government minister, regional governors, and lawmakers. The 27-nation bloc had already imposed 3 rounds of sanctions on Iranian officials. They were for human rights abuses over the protests that erupted in Iran in mid-September over the death of Mahsa Amini. South of our border, a new survey finds American businesses are bracing for leaner times. A survey of national economists in the U.S. says more businesses now expect job reductions at their firms. They also expect to spend less on expansions for the first time since the pandemic. The January survey was done by the National Association for Business Economics, and it's a sign that the U.S. Federal Reserve's push to raise interest rates is doing its job to slow the economy. But the survey shows business owners are still concerned that the Fed's decision-making could push too hard on the economy and potentially put the country into a recession this year. All right, well, in the latest tech layoffs, it looks like Spotify is cutting 6% of its workforce. The music streaming service is the latest tech company to announce job cuts as the post-pandemic economic outlook weakens. In its latest annual report, Spotify reported it had about 6,600 employees, which implies that about 400 jobs are being axed. Last week, Google announced it is slashing 12,000 jobs, while Microsoft said it would cut 10,000. From job cuts to power cuts. Much of Pakistan was left without power today after an energy-saving move by the government backfired. Officials say it started when electricity was turned off during low-usage hours overnight to conserve fuel across the country. Now, that left technicians unable to boot up the system all at once after daybreak. The outage led to panic and raised questions about the cash-strapped government's handling of the country's economic crisis. People across China rang in the Year of the Rabbit yesterday in the aftermath of strict pandemic restrictions. Large family gatherings were held and crowds visited temples in celebration of the Lunar New Year. This comes after muted festivities in the shadow of COVID-19. It is the most important holiday in China, with each year named after one of the 12 signs of the Chinese zodiac in a repeating cycle. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.